from out here, Danielle Smith is regarded, in those medieval maps, they wouldn't know what was in a certain area and they would write there be dragons, when they didn't know,
Hmm.
when the whole world hadn't yet been explored. And I think in Toronto, when they look at Danielle Smith and Alberta, a lot of media said there be dragons. They don't quite understand it. They know it's dangerous and not like Toronto or Ottawa. Danielle Smith has been premier for a little while now. I think she's found her sea legs. I think she's grown into the job. That's how it looks from out here. How does it look to you?
Well, I think the cartographers in Toronto are right when they say, here be dragons in Alberta. Um, we are fire breathing very often. It's a long-standing Alberta tradition that is probably stronger now than it possibly ever has been. Um, without getting too far into it, Danielle Smith had probably the most uh, she had the quickest transference of power likely in Canadian history at any level of government. Normally, when someone wins the leadership of a party, there's a transition period with the outgoing leader, or if they defeat another party in election, there's 2 or 3 weeks, sometimes 4 weeks transition between the parties in power. That didn't happen in Alberta because the city premier, despite being in the same party, was hostile to Smith
You
and
talk
was
about
even
Jason Kenney,
making,
of course.
yes, like he was making spending announcements literally the day of the leadership vote. Um, Totally unprecedented. And so she had herself sworn in. I think she was elected on Thursday or Friday. She was sworn in on a Monday. So there was no transition and therefore no premier's office even to come into. And so it was a chaotic way to hit the ground running, but I think there were good reasons for doing so. Um, but she's never been in government before, except for, I mean, technically a backbencher in the PCs for a few months, but I wouldn't really count that as government experience. She's been in media, she's been in advocacy, she's been in opposition politics, um, but I think she's come now to learn to govern and built a team around her that is a lot more solid than it seemed to be when she took power.
I'm thinking back, and I think that, sometimes you see a resume. I'm sure you get a lot of young people looking to work at Western Standard, and you like to see someone climbing a ladder. But if someone changes jobs every 6 months, you say, well, what's that about? Is there some issue there, some stick to itiveness issue? Who knows? And I say that because if you look at the position of Premier of Alberta, so I'm not talking about the person now, I'm talking about the office.
Mm-hmm.
Jason Kenney, the previous premier, didn't even serve out his full term. Rachel Notley, the previous premier, one term only. If I'm not mistaken, it was Jim Prentice before her. Tell me if I'm getting my memory correct.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah,
have to go back quite far before you get.
you have to go to Ralph Klein.
Well, that's so
This is
we're
one of my
talking
favorite topics.
decades ago.
This is
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, this is one of my favorite topics. I know where you're going with this. Is the least stable political job in Canada is Premier of Alberta. I was in high school the last time an Alberta Premier completed I should say, an Alberta Conservative Premier completed a term in office, um, or was reelected. 2004 was Ralph Klein's last election, and he was more or less pushed out of the leadership after that. And you had Ed Stelmach. He won 2008, pushed out of the party, gone. Alison Redford takes over, wins in 2012, pushed out of the party, gone. Jim Prentice, Hancock in there for a couple of months, but Jim Prentice takes over, loses the election to Notley, um, gone. So we have had only one term or less premiers since Ralph Klein's retirement. And I mean, it's still early days, but I'm going to take a wild gamble here and say that Danielle Smith will be at least the first conservative to make it to a second election.
Right.
If she could literally, even if she loses that election, but if she makes it to that election, she will have been the longest serving conservative premier in Alberta since Klein. And how that next election goes, we can get into that into a bit. But Smith, in ways that Stelmach, Redford, and Kenny never had seems to have the party behind her, at least for the time being. But events have a way of getting in the way of things.
Yeah. Now, would you say that's a bug or a feature that Albertans are like,
Mm.
a rodeo bull that does not like to be ridden and does everything to buck a politician off? I mean, you could look at it as a plus. On the other hand, you're running off in all directions. You're voting for the socialists and you're voting for a conservative. Well, not that kind of conservative. I mean, is it a plus or a minus that no one seems to be able to stay on that bucking bronco?
Well, it depends if you like the cowboy riding the bronco. I have not liked any of the premiers really since Klein, and even Klein in his last years was past his best before Dayton. Probably needed to be bucked. Uh, so yeah, because I've generally not been a fan of Alberta premiers for I guess since I was in high school, before I was an Albertan, I'd say it's a positive bug. Uh, if you happen to like the premier, it's negative. But I think it's largely been a consequence of the conservative, for lack of a better term, and it's not a very accurate term, but the conservative civil war, which you know broke out sort of between uh, some prominent conservatives in the succession of Klein, and the succession of Klein alienated people on the right. That led to the breakaway of Wildrose coming back together with the United Conservative Party. Then and Jason Kenney's very skillful bringing that together, but then disastrous ability to keep it together.
Yeah.
So conservatives in Alberta are, an, the bumper sticker, "Be ungovernable." Well, we live by it for better or worse.
We made a documentary by that name, Ungovernable. I know what you mean.
I remember that.
Well, let me ask you, one of the reasons why I think Toronto folks are nervous about Danielle Smith is that she uses language that only Quebecers are allowed to use, talking about provincial jurisdiction and the federal government should butt out and saying no to Ottawa. And really, I mean, listen, every provincial premier in their own time loves to fight against Ottawa, even Premier Fury of Newfoundland. I mean, even frankly, some liberal premiers are poking at Trudeau because it serves them. But no one's allowed to go full, not nationalist, but provincialist like the Quebecers are. Danielle Smith explicitly uses language like Quebec premiers does. And I think that bugs fancy Toronto folks who they can tolerate it from Quebec, but they hate it from the Cowboys. What do you think?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to the very old two founding nations theory of Canada.
Right.
It's a very upper and lower Canadian view of what is Canada. The prairie provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan in particular, to a lesser extent Manitoba, we were the only provinces not to have already been colonies and negotiate with the federal government and other provinces to join confederation. We are created by fiat. Without getting too deep into the weeds here, Alberta and Saskatchewan came out of the Northwest Territories. We weren't entities before. We wanted to come in together as Buffalo.
Right.
And that was vetoed by Sir Wilfrid Laurier, and an otherwise generally pretty good prime minister, but certainly a Laurentian. His name is Laurier, for God's sakes. Mm-hmm. So Alberta and Saskatchewan and Quebec, I think, were the only provinces with institutional problem with Canada itself. Most other provinces, their issues can be resolved with elections. I don't think our issues can be resolved with elections. The ball can be moved a bit. I mean, things were better for the West under Harper, but he was incapable of making constitutional change. And our issues, like Quebec, are constitutional. And we both seek decentralization. The problem is we seek very different kinds of decentralization. They seek decentralization of social policy for things like culture, the ability to spend money, but they certainly don't want to decentralize the collection of money in Canada, right. Whereas that's our primary concern. So we have constitutional issues, and Smith is much more radical on this than any premier, I think, any of our lifetimes. And I think the big word was sovereignty. And a lot of Anglo Canadians don't understand the use of the word sovereignty in Quebec. There's independentist, people who believe in independence. There's federalists, and then there's sovereigntists. And sovereigntists can be federalists or independentists. It's a spectrum of things. And in Alberta, support for independence goes up and down. It's currently a low ebb because we have I think a provincial government that people feel is fighting for them within Confederation, and people have a large degree of faith that this federal government will be gone. But we have a sovereigntist government here in Alberta for, I believe, the first time ever outside of Quebec. Oh, no, early Confederation. I think it was Nova Scotia had a full-on separatist legislature.